So we're going to continue on with how to build a computer 2020 version. And what you see here is one of my computers, and I have purposely left a few things done incorrectly in here just so we can talk about some of the mistakes people will make as they build a new computer. So should come out to about 20. So really I would say these are my top 20 newbie mistakes, or even folks that have built computers for a while. So let's talk about those. All right, so let's assume that you have correctly installed all your stuff in your computer. You go to turn it on, and suddenly you get a black screen on boot up. Now, lots of things could go wrong there. Sometimes it could be as simple as not installing RAM, all right? But in this case, this guy's not seated all the way. So you've got to make sure that these guys click in on both sides, all right? And so really that's the first thing. Not only that your RAM is installed, but that you've got it seated correctly. So another thing that might cause a problem is if you've got a cable that gets stuck in one of your fans, all right? So depending on which kind of fan it is, it may either just give you an error, or your computer might not boot up at all. So we want to make sure that we've got all of our cables tied down. And I've purposely made this a mess. All this stuff should be routed around the back. Now, if you have a cable in your good old CPU fan, all right, or making contact with that, that is going to not allow your computer to start up, all right? So usually you have to be concerned about these Intel cables. So make sure they are out of the way. Preferably, you would not use a Intel CPU fan, but a much better CPU cooler. So let's talk graphics cards, all right? A lot of things can go wrong here. First, is the graphics card seated correctly, all right? If it's not, that's a problem. Now, this one is not hard to screw up. While this will most likely stay seated in here, you want to make sure you fasten these down, because there is the potential that this graphics card could actually fall one side, put this thing upright, and potentially damage other components. So another huge one that people will forget is basically attaching your power supplies for your graphics card, okay? This guy is a 6+8, okay? You want to make sure that your power supply has at least a minimum of 6+8 to power this up. Now, we've got 850 watt here, and I believe I've got either 2 sets of these or 4 sets. I can't remember. This thing's got a lot of capability. But yeah, you want to make sure that these are connected. You don't want to do 6 and 6. It's got to be 8 and 6 on this one, okay? And other graphics cards will have different variations. They may not require power. They may get all their power from the PCI Express connector, okay, which is about 75 watts. In this case, though, this guy needs a lot more power, all right? So it's 2020, and let's say that's an i5-9400F there, or an i3-9100F, or an i7-9700KF. If I don't have a graphics card in there, I'm not going to see anything but a black screen on boot up. So make sure that you have a graphics card installed right off the bat. All right, so along those lines, we've got a graphics card installed. And I go to boot up, and I have plugged in my HDMI over here, all right? So if this is an F-type processor, you definitely will not get any output over here, all right? So you want to make sure that you have your display connectors hooked up to your graphics card. All right, another common mistake is not having the proper power supply. Okay, so something like this, where I honestly can't remember what CPU's under there. Let's say it's a i5 9600K, and I'm not the smartest guy because I did not use a real CPU cooler. Those run about 90 some watts. This graphics card possibly requires at least 200 watts. And I'm sure overall the system is recommending at least 550 watts, or 500 to 550. Okay, so this, had I installed something like this, it would not cut it, right? It would not have enough power. It will boot up, but the second I go play a game, it's gonna at some point during that game require more power than that can put out. And next thing you know, I will end up seeing a black screen, then the computer will reboot. So you want to make sure that you properly size your power supply. All right, so another thing very common to do, and something yours truly occasionally screws up. You've got to make sure when you seat your CPU cooler that it is seated squarely. Maybe that's not the right word, but basically you've got two flat surfaces. You want them to be pretty much lying, completely on top of each other, right? You don't want this up at an angle. So making sure that these are all connected will allow that to sit correctly. In other CPU coolers like this guy, which in my opinion is superior to your Intel one because of just basically those steel screws. A lot easier to tell with that one that it's seated correctly. This guy, these things, wear out over time, so don't expect to continually uninstall your Intel fans without having some problems later on. But yeah, making sure that your CPU fan is seated firmly is highly important to the life of the CPU. Now, another thing you want to make sure you do, you see that right there? Make sure that guy is connected, okay? If you forget to do that, and when you have something like this big old Noctua dual tower, dual fan CPU cooler, it's going to be a real hassle after the fact to try and connect that. All right, so now another very common thing that people can screw up. And I remember selling a CPU in perfect condition on eBay, and somebody tried to tell me that the CPU was damaged. So I know for a fact it was not. And basically what happens, a lot of new people, when you go to install your CPU in here, if you don't have that thing seated correctly in there, when you go to put this down and then basically put this back in place, this will pop out. You can basically wreck not only your CPU but the motherboard itself. All right, so making sure that when you get your CPU that you line things up correctly. And there's a little mark on your CPU that matches up with that, as well as over, if I were to take this off, a lot of times there'll be a triangle there to let you know that you've lined your CPU correctly. All right, so it's 2020. This case, this case has 4 USB 3.0s and a 3.1 on it, okay? So make sure that if you're going to buy a case like this, that your motherboard supports this. So this guy here partially supports it, and eventually yours truly will replace this with a different motherboard. But here you see the connector for USB 3.1, and here is the USB 3.0. So Type-C and the regular 3.0. It doesn't have an additional spot for the other USB 3.0. So I will only be able to use one half of this. All right. So another thing, when you first start up your computer, you do not actually need to have a hard drive or solid state drive hooked up. Okay. And yours truly prefers not to actually have it in there to make sure that it'll boot to BIOS. Then I will put my my drive in. So sometimes, reason I say that, sometimes people will use a drive from another computer that has already had the OS installed. It's got all the drivers from another computer, mainly the motherboard, graphics card, and it may not work correctly right off the bat. So sometimes it actually does, and you can, Windows will do its magic and update everything, and you'll be good to go. But there are other times where you're like, wow, I'm not even getting any kind of connection. All right, so be wary of that. So I didn't show this one. Here's another place where a cable is going to be a problem with a fan. And, orienting these so that you can route the cable correctly is important. And in this case, I'm going to go in and unscrew this, rotate it around, and make sure that that cable will not ever come in contact with that fan. And you can tell that it's definitely going to be a future problem. All right, so, something else that one could do. Now, these fans, these Intel fans, they will work with an i5 9600K, i3 9350 KF. But, it's not a wise choice, right? You want to spend some money and protect your investment. I've got an i9, a Ryzen 9. i9, I spent a bunch of money and got a huge Noctua cooler, which I showed previously. The Ryzen 9, I'm using the stock cooler, which, very similar to this guy here, right? But it's got the RGB lights. Looks pretty, but I'll tell you what, that thing is freaking hot. I need to go spend some money and protect that investment, okay? It's going to be worth the $50 to $90 or whatever that I spend to ensure that CPU has a longer life. All right, so here is the Ryzen 9 with its stock cooler. And I don't have my temperature gauge, but it is definitely really warm in there, so kind of a scary thing. But that leads us to the next point, and see if I can get in there. So we've got some 3000 and 3200 megahertz RAM in here, and another common thing is to expect that, hey, once I boot these computers up, that they will actually work automatically at 3000, 3200, whatever megahertz, right? So you're going to have to go in the BIOS and actually make those changes yourself, all right? Because usually, from what I've seen, they will basically start at 2666 hertz, all right? So you're not getting all that you can get out of your RAM. All right, case connector. So depending on the motherboard, you may have, usually you've got, let's say 5, 6 of these to connect, and you have to do it correctly, okay? If you don't do it correctly, your computer may turn on, but it may not work, or your computer won't turn on at all, or it will stay permanently on. There's a lot of different things that can happen there when you don't attach those. So a lot of times you'll see on your motherboard, not on this one, it will actually tell you which one's which. It might actually... Well, so this is where you have to check your manual. I don't have a motherboard sitting out right now that has them actually labeled for you, but knowing how to connect your HDD light, your power LED, your power, your reset switch, very important. And it's easy to put one of these in and only install one connector and have it hanging over, or miss a spot and be too far to the right. Also, your little computer speaker usually connects into these guys so that you can at least hear that beep on startup, which is a nice thing to have. So a lot of things here, folks, can go wrong with building a computer in 2020. So like I said, this is purposely, you know, kind of a disaster in here just to make this video out of it. But, you know, obviously we want to clean up as much of this as we can. Getting this cable securely out of the way, ensure it doesn't ever hit this fan blade. Making sure all these guys are nice and secure, preferably using a better CPU cooler if you have a CPU that can be overclocked. You definitely do not want to go with the Intel fan. You know, other places, case fan here. Making sure all of these cables are tied down, preferably routing these around the back. You know, that's another, I guess, newbie thing, right? Not realizing the other side of this case, you can route your connectors. It's a lot easier, you know, to just run them straight from the power supply or whatever to the motherboard. However, it turns into a disaster later. Knowing, you know, one thing that we didn't talk about is if you have two hard drives installed and let's say both of them have operating systems on them, you know, you may end up having some issues with which one it boots to. So lots of things to be concerned about. And hopefully, you know, you guys will figure it out in the end. So 2020, hopefully you guys got something out of this. You know, even though this is actually somewhat close to being a completed project here, it is not. So, you know, when you see this, hopefully in a video in the future, we'll have all these cables around the back. So we didn't really talk about that as a newbie thing, but easier to run all these cables from the power supply to where they connect here, right? But all those extra cables end up looking sloppy. They get stuck in fans. All kinds of things can go right. So knowing how to route your cables around to the right hand side access panel, in this case has a big old cavity there to run those things. Lots of places to use zip ties. Okay, you're gonna need zip ties and a lot of other things you can use too. If you don't have zip ties, something like this guy here will work as well. But yeah, running your cables properly, very important. Making sure things are properly powered up. Making sure things are properly fastened. Okay, we didn't talk about it, but with the motherboard, potentially you could use the wrong screws connecting your motherboard. Okay, so your case will come with a bunch of different size screws. And it's always good before you assemble this to go in and figure out which screws actually work with the standoffs. Okay, there'll be these gold or silver things that basically pop this motherboard maybe a 1/4 inch off of the case. And so you're going to tighten in different places on your motherboard to that, right? So, you know, you want to make sure you use the right screw, because if you use the wrong screw, it's going to look like you fastened it. But in reality, this thing can pop off if you use the wrong one. So lots of different things there. May have been over 20 items, folks, that you could do, things you could screw up. And you know, there are a lot of other things with RAM that could go wrong. Knowing which locations you can get away with putting a single stick or 2 sticks of RAM, because some motherboards will actually specify which location. Usually if you have 2 slots, it doesn't seem to be a problem. But when you have 4, sometimes, you know, it can tell you specifically where you need to start with. All right, so oh yeah, one other thing. So if you are actually going to use a hard drive, don't forget that like this hard drive has 2 things that has to be connected. One is the SATA 3 cable that we have there, and the other is your SATA power, okay, which we show here. So this one does not actually have both connected. So yeah, make sure you have all that stuff. Yeah, that's going to do it, folks. I hope you got something out of this. God, that was a pretty long video, I know. And thanks for checking out the video. Please like, please subscribe.